It was just a piece of bread.
The security camera footage showed everything in cold, digital clarity. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the container of leftover chicken, her eyes darting toward the kitchen doorway. She was 63 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and hands weathered from 30 years of cleaning other people's homes. In that moment, captured by an unblinking lens, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had run out of choices. What the camera couldn't capture was the weight she carried, the reason her shoulders sagged as she slipped that food into her worn canvas bag. It couldn't see the framed photograph tucked in her pocket, or the hospital bills stacked on her kitchen table, or the phone call she'd received that morning that had broken something inside her. All the camera saw was theft. But sometimes the eye of the machine misses what the human heart should see. "Where are you watching from tonight?" 3 months earlier, Margaret had walked through the iron gates of the Harrison estate for the first time, her resume clutched in one hand and hope flickering in her chest like a candle in the wind. The mansion rose before her like something from a magazine, all white columns and gleaming windows that caught the morning sun. She'd applied for dozens of jobs that summer, each rejection another small wound, until finally this one came through. Robert Harrison needed a housekeeper, and Margaret needed to survive. Robert Harrison wasn't what she expected. At 57, he'd built an empire in real estate development, his face occasionally appearing in business magazines with titles like The Man Who Rebuilt Downtown or Harrison's Golden Touch. But the man who interviewed her that first day seemed distracted, his eyes constantly flicking to his phone, his questions perfunctory. He barely looked at her as he outlined the job, Monday through Friday, 8 to 4, maintaining the main house while he worked in his office or traveled for business. The pay was decent, enough to help with the bills that had been piling up since her husband died 2 years ago. "I keep to myself." "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said, using her last name though she'd introduced herself as Margaret. "I expect the same courtesy." "Do your work, don't disturb me, and we'll get along fine." She'd nodded, grateful just to have the opportunity. That was before she understood what those words really meant, that she would spend her days in a house filled with everything, and occupied by a man who seemed to have nothing at all. The first weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. Margaret arrived each morning at 8 sharp, let herself in with the key Robert had given her, and set about her work. She dusted the mahogany furniture in rooms that looked like no one ever sat in them, vacuumed carpets that showed no footprints, arranged fresh flowers in vases for a man who never seemed to notice them. The house was beautiful and empty, like a museum after hours. Robert kept to his study on the 2nd floor, his door always closed. Sometimes she'd hear his voice through the heavy oak, sharp and demanding as he spoke on conference calls. Other times there was only silence, which somehow felt worse. On the rare occasions they crossed paths, her coming up the stairs as he descended, or both reaching for coffee in the kitchen, he'd give her a curt nod and nothing more. She was furniture to him, she realized. Necessary but invisible. What struck her most was the waste. The refrigerator overflowed with food from an expensive meal service, gourmet dinners delivered daily in elegant packaging. Most of it went uneaten. She'd find containers of salmon and roasted vegetables, artisan breads and imported cheeses, all reaching their expiration dates. The first time she asked if she should throw away the old food, Robert had waved his hand dismissively. "Whatever you think is best." "Mrs. Patterson, just handle it." So she did, tossing away food that could have fed a family for a week. Each time something twisted in her stomach. She thought of her own small apartment, her own careful budgeting, the way she planned each meal to stretch her paycheck. But Margaret had her own troubles, heavier than she'd let anyone know. Her grandson Tommy, 7 years old with his father's bright eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, had been diagnosed with leukemia 6 months ago. Her daughter Jessica worked 2 jobs and still couldn't cover the medical bills that mounted like snowdrifts. Margaret sent what she could, but it was never enough, never close to enough. She kept a photograph of Tommy in her purse, his school picture from last fall, before he got sick, when his smile was wide and uncomplicated. Some mornings, standing in Robert Harrison's spotless kitchen surrounded by abundance, she'd take out that photo and just look at it, trying to gather strength for the day ahead. Then came the afternoon when everything shifted. She was cleaning Robert's study, he'd gone out for a meeting, when she noticed his computer screen was still on. She shouldn't have looked. She knew better. But something in the email preview caught her eye. Words like offshore accounts and concealed assets and if the IRS discovers. Margaret quickly turned away, her heart hammering. It wasn't her business. She was just the housekeeper. But the words stayed with her, settling in her mind like stones in still water. That evening, she received the call. Jessica, her voice breaking, explained that Tommy needed a new treatment, something the insurance wouldn't fully cover. They needed $12,000 within 2 weeks, or they'd have to wait, and waiting might mean… Jessica couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret couldn't breathe. $12,000 might as well have been $12 million. She had nothing left to give, nothing left to sell. No one left to ask. That night, she lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, and thought about all that food going to waste in Robert Harrison's kitchen. The first time was the hardest. Margaret stood in the kitchen that Monday morning, her hands shaking as she looked at the containers of food scheduled for disposal. There was enough here for days. A roasted chicken, still warm in its packaging, fresh bread, fruit, vegetables. Tommy loved chicken. She could take it to Jessica, help with the grocery bills, save them a little money that could go toward the treatment instead. She told herself it was just going to be thrown away anyway. She told herself Robert would never notice, never care. She told herself it wasn't really stealing if it was destined for the garbage. But her hands still shook as she transferred the food into her canvas bag, and her heart still raced as she carried it out to her car. That night, watching Jessica heat up the chicken for Tommy, seeing her grandson eat with something like his old appetite, Margaret felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. Maybe this was okay. Maybe this was just being practical. The second time was easier. And the third, Margaret developed a system, always careful, always modest. She took only what was about to expire, only what would otherwise be wasted. She never touched anything fresh, never took more than she could justify. But justification was a slippery thing she was learning. Each time the line moved just a little, Robert still barely acknowledged her presence. He seemed increasingly distracted, his phone calls growing longer and his tone sharper. One morning, she overheard him speaking to someone. His lawyer, she gathered, his voice tight with something that sounded like fear beneath the anger. I don't care what it takes, Martin. The audit can't happen. If they look too closely at the foundation accounts, if they trace the transfers… He stopped abruptly, and Margaret realized he'd noticed her passing in the hallway. His eyes met hers for a long moment, cold and assessing, and she felt her stomach drop. But he just closed his office door, and his voice became a muffled rumble behind the wood. That afternoon, she found an envelope on the kitchen counter with her name on it. Inside was a note in Robert's angular handwriting. Mrs. Patterson, I'll be traveling more frequently in the coming weeks. Continue as usual. The security system is now fully activated in all areas. RH security system. Margaret's mouth went dry. Had he noticed? Did he know? She looked up and, for the first time, really noticed the small cameras tucked discreetly in the corners of every room. How had she missed them before? How had she been so careless? She told herself to stop, to never take anything again. But that evening, Jessica called with news that made Margaret's world tilt. Tommy's treatment needed to start sooner than expected, and they were still $8,000 short. Jessica was crying, apologizing, saying she didn't know what else to do. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to put this on you, but I don't know where else to turn. Margaret closed her eyes and made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. We'll figure it out, sweetheart. I promise. We'll find a way. After she hung up, she sat in the darkness of her apartment and faced the truth she'd been avoiding. There was no other way. No miracle was coming. She had $200 in savings, no assets, no options. The only thing she had was access to a kitchen full of food in a mansion owned by a man who had more money than he could spend, and apparently more secrets than he could count. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the mansion with her mind made up. She'd take a little more this time, sell what she could at the community market, save every penny. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong, But what was right when a child's life hung in the balance? Didn't need outweigh ownership? Didn't Tommy's chance at survival matter more than Robert Harrison's surplus? She was packing containers into her bag, her movements quick and practiced now, when she heard the front door open. Too early. Robert wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Margaret's heart seized in her chest. She turned, the bag still in her hands, and found herself face to face with him. Robert stood in the kitchen doorway, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Margaret felt the heat rise in her face, shame and fear battling for dominance. This was it. She was caught. She'd lose the job, maybe face charges, and then what would Jessica and Tommy do? "Mr. Harrison, Her voice cracked. "I can explain." His eyes moved from her face to the bag, and something flickered across his features. Not anger, as she'd expected, but something colder. Calculation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Almost careful. "I think you better put that down." "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret set the bag on the counter, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry. I know it was wrong. I'll pay you back every bit of it. Please, my grandson is sick, and I don't want to hear it." Robert pulled out his phone. "I trusted you in my home. I gave you a job, and this is how you repay that trust?" "Please," Margaret heard herself say, hating the desperation in her voice. "Please don't call the police. I'll leave right now. You'll never see me again." Robert looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her skin crawl. Not fury, but opportunity. He was thinking, weighing options. If this moment touched your heart, if you're feeling the weight of Margaret's impossible choice, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps us share these important stories with more people. "No," he said finally. "I think the police need to know about this. People need to face consequences for their actions, Mrs. Patterson. Otherwise, where would we be?" He dialed. Margaret stood frozen, watching her life collapse around her, and wondered if her grandson would understand why his grandmother wasn't there when he needed her most. The 20 minutes waiting for the police were the longest of Margaret's life. Robert had gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table, then positioned himself between her and the door as if she might bolt. She wouldn't, though. Running had never been in her nature. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to keep them from shaking, and thought about all the ways she'd failed. Failed her daughter. Failed Tommy, failed herself. She'd spent 63 years trying to do the right thing, to be honest and hard-working and kind. And here she was, about to be arrested like a common criminal. The irony twisted in her gut like a knife. All that food, destined for the garbage, and now her whole life would be garbage too. Robert paced by the window, checking his watch repeatedly. He seemed agitated, though whether from anger or something else Margaret couldn't tell. Twice he started to say something to her, then stopped. Finally he spoke without looking at her. "How long has this been going on?" Margaret's throat felt like sandpaper. "A few weeks. Maybe a month. And you thought I wouldn't notice? Thought I was too stupid or too careless? I thought—" She stopped, then made herself continue. "What did it matter now? I thought the food was going to waste anyway. I thought maybe it could do some good instead." "Good." He laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "You're stealing from me and calling it good? My grandson has leukemia." The words came out flat, exhausted. "He's 7 years old. The treatment costs more than I'll make in 5 years. My daughter works herself to the bone, and it's still not enough. So yes, I took your leftover food, the food you were throwing away, and I thought maybe—" Her voice broke. "Maybe it was one small thing I could do to help them." For the first time, Robert looked directly at her. Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or discomfort, but it vanished quickly. "That's not my problem." "No," Margaret agreed quietly. "It's not. Nothing is your problem except yourself, is it, Mr. Harrison?" She saw him stiffen, saw anger flash in his eyes. But before he could respond, the doorbell rang. He strode to answer it, and Margaret heard the murmur of voices in the foyer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was real now. This was happening. But when Robert returned, he wasn't alone with uniformed officers. He was with 2 men in plain clothes, their faces serious, their badges identifying them as federal agents. Detective Marcus Chen, older with graying hair, looked at Margaret with curiosity. His partner, Agent Sarah Williams, younger and sharp-eyed, scanned the room with professional assessment. Robert's face had gone pale. "I called about a theft," he said, his voice strained. "My housekeeper has been stealing from me. I have video evidence." "Mr. Harrison," Detective Chen interrupted, "we're not here about your housekeeper." The room seemed to tilt. Margaret watched, confusion replacing fear, as Robert's expression shifted from anger to something that looked like panic. "What?" "Then why?" "Robert Harrison," Agent Williams said, her voice formal and final. "You're under arrest for tax fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement of charitable funds." "You have the right to remain silent." The words continued, but Margaret barely heard them over the roaring in her ears. She watched as if from a great distance as Robert's face drained of all color, as he stammered something about lawyers and mistakes, as Agent Williams calmly took his arm. Detective Chen was saying something to her, but his voice seemed to come from underwater. "Ma'am?" "Mrs. Patterson?" She blinked, focused on the detective's kind face. "Are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" "I don't understand," she managed. "He called you about me. About the food I took." Detective Chen glanced at his partner, who was leading a protesting Robert toward the door, then back at Margaret. "We've been investigating Mr. Harrison for 8 months. When we got his call about a theft, we realized he was home and moved up our timeline. We weren't here for you, Mrs. Patterson. We were already coming for him." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his manner gentle. "We've been building a case against him for running a fraudulent charity foundation. He was supposed to be building housing for low-income families. Instead, he was funneling the money into offshore accounts. Nearly $20 million that was meant to help people who had nothing." Margaret thought about the emails she'd glimpsed, the tense phone calls, Robert's increasing agitation. It all made a terrible kind of sense. Have you ever faced a moment that changed everything you thought you knew? A time when the world flipped upside down? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. "What about the food I took?" she asked quietly. "I did take it. He has video proof." Detective Chen looked at her thoughtfully. "That's between you and Mr. Harrison, and somehow, I don't think he's going to be pressing charges from federal prison." "But Mrs. Patterson," he paused, "why did you do it?" So she told him. About Tommy, about the bills, about standing in a kitchen full of abundance while her family went without. She told him everything, her voice steady now, because what else could they do to her that life hadn't already done? When she finished, Detective Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "My sister's son had leukemia," he said softly. "He's 18 now, healthy, heading to college in the fall. I know what those bills look like. I know what that fear feels like." He pressed the card into her hand. "This is the number for the Children's Hospital Assistance Fund. They helped us. They can help you too." Margaret looked down at the card, her vision blurring with tears, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the world had some kindness left in it after all. The next few days passed in a blur of unreality. Margaret gave her statement to the federal agents, describing what she'd observed of Robert Harrison's behavior, the fragments of conversations she'd overheard. They were kind to her, these investigators, treating her not as an accomplice or a criminal, but as a witness to something larger than her own small transgression. The story broke on the evening news 2 days later. Margaret watched from her apartment, Jessica beside her on the worn couch, as reporters stood outside the Harrison mansion and detailed the scope of Robert's crimes. The New Hope Housing Foundation, which was supposed to have built affordable homes for struggling families, had been nothing but a shell. Robert had pocketed donations, fabricated construction costs, and moved millions into accounts scattered across 3 countries. The families who were supposed to be helped, people like Margaret herself, people who worked hard and still couldn't make ends meet, had been left with nothing but broken promises. "Mom," Jessica said softly, watching Margaret's face, "are you okay?" Was she? Margaret didn't know. She felt hollowed out, like something essential had been scooped from her chest. She'd spent weeks drowning in guilt over taking food from a man's kitchen, believing herself to be a thief, a failure of character. And all that time, that man had been stealing millions from people who had nothing. The mathematics of it didn't make sense. The morality of it didn't make sense. "I don't know what I am," she said finally. "But I called that number the detective gave me." Jessica turned to her, hope and fear mixing in her expression. And they want to talk to us. About Tommy's treatment, about financial assistance. Margaret's voice wavered. They said they help families exactly like ours. That we shouldn't have to choose between bankruptcy and our child's life. Jessica started to cry then. The kind of tears that come from pressure released, from a dam finally breaking. Margaret held her daughter and let her own tears come too. All the fear and shame and exhaustion of the past months pouring out. The meeting with the assistance fund coordinator happened on a Tuesday morning in a small office that smelled like coffee and had children's drawings taped to the walls. Elena Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a warm handshake, spread Tommy's medical records across her desk and explained how the program worked. "We can cover about 60% of the treatment costs that insurance won't," she said. "And we have partnerships with the hospital to reduce the remaining balance. It won't be free, but it will be manageable. You won't lose your home. You won't have to choose." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but real. "There's something else," Elena continued. "Detective Chen mentioned your situation to me, about your former employer." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "What you did, taking the food, it came from desperation. I'm not here to judge that, but I want you to understand that you matter, Mrs. Patterson. Your family matters. And there were resources available, people who could have helped if you'd known to ask." "I didn't know," Margaret whispered. "I didn't know who to ask or where to turn." "A lot of people don't," Elena said gently. "That's why we're here. That's why we do this work. Because no one should have to face what you faced alone." Over the following weeks, as Tommy began his new treatment protocol and Jessica's shoulders seemed to carry less weight, Margaret found herself thinking about Robert Harrison. Not with anger exactly, though that was there too, but with a strange kind of pity. He'd had everything, wealth, position, opportunity, and he'd chosen to take more. She'd had almost nothing, and had taken what she thought was garbage. And somehow, in the twisted accounting of the universe, he was the criminal, and she was being helped. The day before Tommy's first successful treatment milestone, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Detective Chen stood at her apartment door, looking slightly uncomfortable in casual clothes rather than his suit. "I hope this isn't intrusive," he said. "I wanted to see how your grandson was doing." She invited him in, served him tea in her small kitchen, and showed him the photograph she carried. A new one now. Taken last week, where Tommy was thin and tired but smiling, fighting his way back to health. "Elena told me you've been volunteering at the Assistance Fund office," Chen said. "Answering phones, helping other families navigate the system. If you've been with us on this journey, if Margaret's story has touched you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, resilience, and the unexpected turns life takes. We share these stories because they matter, because you matter." Margaret nodded. "I thought, after everything they did for us, I wanted to give something back. To help other people who feel as lost as I did." Chen smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "That's good. That's really good." After he left, Margaret sat by her window and watched the evening settle over her neighborhood. The apartment was still small, her savings still minimal, her life still far from easy. But something fundamental had shifted. She'd walked through fire and found that she wasn't alone, that kindness existed, that help was possible, that the world contained more grace than she'd dared to believe. Tomorrow, she would answer phones at the Assistance Fund. She would talk to desperate parents and overwhelmed families, and she would tell them what she'd learned, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that resources existed, that they didn't have to carry their burdens alone. But tonight, she would simply sit in gratitude, holding space for all that had been lost and all that had been found. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the Assistance Fund office on a bright spring morning, helping a young mother fill out paperwork for her daughter's surgery. The woman's hands shook as she wrote, and Margaret recognized that tremor. The weight of fear and hope mixed together, the terror of not being enough for your child. She reached across the desk and gently steadied the woman's hand. "It's going to be okay. Margaret said softly. "You've taken the hardest step already. You've asked for help. The rest we'll figure out together." The woman looked up, tears brimming in her eyes, and nodded. Margaret saw herself in that face, the self 6 months ago, lost and desperate and convinced she had to carry everything alone. She understood now that there were two kinds of taking. The kind that came from greed, like Robert Harrison's theft of millions from people who had nothing. And the kind that came from need, from a grandmother's desperate love for a child she couldn't bear to lose. Context mattered, intent mattered, and mercy, she'd learned, mattered most of all. Tommy was in remission now, his latest scans showing no trace of cancer. He'd lost most of his hair during treatment, but it was growing back in soft curls that made him look even younger than his 7 years. Last weekend, he'd asked Margaret to take him to the park, and she'd pushed him on the swings just like she used to, before the word leukemia had entered their vocabulary. His laughter, bright and unguarded, had been the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Jessica had been able to cut back to one job, thanks to the assistance fund's help and some additional support from a local charity that Detective Chen had connected them with. She looked less exhausted now, less like she was running on fumes and willpower alone. Mother and daughter had dinner together every Sunday, just the three of them, and those evenings felt like sacred time, proof that they'd survived, that they were still together, that love had been enough to carry them through. As for Robert Harrison, his trial had concluded 2 months ago. The news showed him being led from the courthouse, shoulders slumped, his expensive suit unable to hide the fact that he'd shrunk somehow, diminished by his own choices. He'd been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to repay the stolen funds. Some of that money, Margaret had heard, would go to actually building the homes he'd promised, affordable housing for families who needed it. A different kind of justice, perhaps, a way for something good to come from something terrible. Margaret had been asked to testify at the trial, but the prosecution ultimately didn't need her. They had forensic accountants, paper trails, documented proof of every lie and stolen dollar. She'd been relieved, honestly. She didn't want to face Robert Harrison again, didn't want to carry any more of his darkness than she already had. But sometimes, in quiet moments, she thought about him. She wondered if he understood yet what he'd lost. Not the money or the mansion or his freedom, those were obvious, but the chance to matter, to use his resources for genuine good, to be remembered as someone who helped rather than someone who stole. He'd had everything and chosen nothing that counted. She'd had almost nothing and found everything that mattered. Elena had offered Margaret a part-time paid position at the assistance fund, helping to coordinate volunteers and manage the intake process for new families. It didn't pay much, but combined with her social security and the modest savings she was finally able to build, it was enough. More importantly, it gave her purpose. Each family she helped, each desperate parent she could guide toward resources and relief, felt like a small redemption, not for what she'd done, but for what she'd learned from it. Detective Chen had become an unexpected friend. He stopped by the office occasionally, sometimes with information about other assistance programs, sometimes just to chat. His nephew, the leukemia survivor, had visited once to talk to the families in the waiting room, sharing his story of treatment and recovery. Margaret had watched Tommy listen, riveted, absorbing the hope that came from seeing someone who'd walked the same path and made it through. "You know what I've learned?" Chen had said to her one day, as they stood together watching the children play in the office's small courtyard. "The world is full of people who have more than they need, and people who need more than they have. The tragedy isn't that the distribution is unequal. That's just reality. The tragedy is when the people with more don't see the people with less, when they step over the need and pretend it isn't there." Margaret had nodded, thinking of Robert Harrison's kitchen, of all that food going to waste while she'd struggled to feed her family. And when people who need help are too ashamed to ask for it. That too, Chen agreed. Pride and blindness. They're probably responsible for more suffering than actual evil. Now, finishing up with the young mother, securing her daughter's surgical funding, Margaret reflected on how strange the path had been from that terrible morning when she'd been caught with stolen food to this moment, helping others navigate their own crises. She'd been so certain that day was the end of everything. Instead, it had been a beginning. She'd learned that sometimes you have to break before you can rebuild stronger. That shame could blind you to help that was available. That kindness existed in unexpected places, from federal detectives and assistance fund coordinators and strangers who chose to care. That asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. That the measure of a person wasn't in their worst moment, but in what they built from it. Tommy's photograph sat on her desk now, the newest one, taken last week at his school's spring celebration. He was wearing his favorite dinosaur shirt, his hair grown back thick and healthy, his smile wide and uncomplicated again. Every time Margaret looked at it, she felt gratitude so profound it almost hurt. The young mother across from her stood up, clutching her approved paperwork, her expression transformed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome," Margaret said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "And remember, you're not alone. You never were. Sometimes we just need help seeing the hands reaching out to catch us." After the woman left, Margaret tidied her desk and prepared to close the office for the evening. Tomorrow, 3 new families were scheduled for intake appointments. Tomorrow, she would answer phones and coordinate volunteers and help guide desperate people toward the resources that could save them. Tomorrow, she would continue building this new life that had emerged from the ashes of her old one. But tonight, she would drive to Jessica's apartment for Sunday dinner. She would hold Tommy close and feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. She would sit with her daughter and grandson and count her blessings. Not the blessings of wealth or ease, but the ones that actually mattered. Love, health, second chances, community, grace. If this story touched your heart, if Margaret's journey resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, hope, and the unexpected ways our lives can change. Every comment, like, and subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories, who need to know they're not alone. Thank you for spending this time with us, for opening your heart to Margaret's story. May you recognize the helpers in your own life, and may you have the courage to ask for help when you need it. Until next time, take care of each other. That's what matters most.